ladies and gentlemen. Today I would like to speak about fragmentation in global economies and future of the international monetary system. As we all know, since the Ukraine war started in February 2022, fragmentation in global economies has become crystal clear. G7 countries have imposed severe economic and financial sanctions on Russia, and many G7 companies have exited from Russia. But even before the Ukraine war, the United States had imposed heavy tariff on Chinese goods and recently introduced strong regulation over high-tech export to China. And all other G7 countries are following such regulations. So the world economy is now fragmented. I have distributed one table to all of you, and if you kindly look at this table, this shows fragmentation in global economies reflected among G20. As you know, G20 was established in 1999 after the Asian currency crisis. At that time, it was G20 finance ministers and central bank governors meeting. But after the Lehman crisis in 2008, G20 was upgraded to G20 summit. So political leaders of G20 countries every year meet and discuss global economic challenges, issues. And since 2008, G20 has become or had become the primary international body to discuss about the global economic and financial issues or problems, agendas, and sought to find some conclusions or solutions of those problems. But as I said before, after the Ukraine war, the G20 has stopped performing, or I should say, functioning appropriately. So I have prepared a table showing 20 countries. Actually, G20 consists of 19 countries plus European Union. And these 20 countries represent jointly about 85% of the global GDP. So looking at G20 member countries, you can, broadly speaking, you can understand the current global economic situation. On the extreme left-hand side, I have shown Group A, Group B, and Group C. These naming is my own, so it's not official. But participating in the G20 meeting in the last more than 10 years, and particularly participating in the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors meeting last year and early this year, I felt that the G20 has been really fragmented, divided into three groups. Group A consists of
China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. When G20 discussed about the need of debt reduction for Zambia or Sri Lanka or many other developing countries, China continued to be opposed to such agreement or communique. And of course, G7 countries severely criticized Russia for its invasion to Ukraine and requested Russia to immediately end the war and go back to Russia. But of course, Russia refused to accept such allegation and never accept any reference to the Russian invasion into Ukraine in the G20 communique. Actually, communique is must be agreed unanimously. So, if one country objects, then communique cannot be issued. And for slightly more than 1 year, G20 summit could not issue communique. This time in India, G20 communique was somehow issued by G20 summit, but as you can see, the content, the subject of communique is quite unclear and undecisive. Saudi Arabia, when some G20 member countries argued for increased oil production, because last year oil prices went up quite sharply, but Saudi Arabia has never accepted that sort of argument. So these three countries are in some sort of tag match to argue against various argument made by the Group B countries. Group B countries consist of G7 plus Australia, including, of course, European Union. And they have imposed very severe economic and financial sanctions on Russia. And as I said, many companies, not only oil companies, but trading companies, manufacturing companies, even accounting firms left Russia after the Ukraine war started in February 2022. Thus, Group C consists of so-called Global South, and Group C countries continue to take somewhat neutral position vis-a-vis Group A and Group B, and intend to continue good economic relation with Group A countries as well as Group B countries. So the fragmentation is quite clear now, and since this fragmentation has been caused basically military and security reasons, it is very difficult to predict when this kind of fragmentation ends or be reduced. But one thing is quite clear, that is the Russian economy. As I said before, European countries and US, Japan, and Australia have imposed very strict regulations over economic transactions with Russia. And as you may know, the largest component of Russia's export consists of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, substantially exported to Europe. But this trade has almost completely cut out. And the famous natural gas pipeline in the North Sea, 2 gas pipelines were destroyed. And the European Union clearly stated that even after the Russian or Ukraine war is ended, European Union would not restore this kind of economic relationship with Russia. That means that they would not depend on fossil fuels imported from Russia anymore. And this means that Russia would not import automobiles, IT goods, consumer goods from Europe anymore. So economic relations between Russia and Europe is completely cut and discontinued and would not recover. Of course, currently Russia exports oil and gas to China as well as India and the global South countries, but with somewhat discounted prices. And so the Russian economy is seriously affected by the Ukraine war. And even after the Ukraine war is ended, the Russian economy would suffer significantly. And the international community has already agreed to carbon half by 2030 and carbon neutral by 2050. That means that the fossil fuel producer prices would continue to decline towards zero, even if consumer prices of fossil fuels may continue to rise because of carbon tax. But this means that the Russian economy would be permanently depressed by this kind of agreement of climate change response. So anyway, the Russian economy has almost no impact on the United States and Japan. For instance, only 1% of Japanese exports go to Russia, and only 3–4% of Japanese imports come from Russia. And most of our import from Russia consists of natural gas. But even here, only about 7% of natural gas import by Japan comes from Russia. Large part of natural gas import comes from Australia, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Qatar with long-term contracts. So even for Japan, the Russian economy has almost no impact. Whether Russian economy collapses or not, that would not affect the Japanese economy almost nothing. But China is different. The extreme right-hand side column shows for each country which is the biggest trading partner, export or import. And for China, the largest export market is the United States, and the largest import source is Taiwan. I checked with 2022 China customs data statistics, and I found that Taiwan is the largest import source for China in 2022, and almost all of Chinese import from Taiwan consist of semiconductors. For Russia, China is already the largest export market and the largest source of import. And amazingly, for Saudi Arabia, the largest export market is China, and the largest import source is already China. For Group B countries, US, because of North American Free Trade Agreement, Canada is the largest export market, but China is the largest source of import for the United States. But this year, the January to June statistics showed that the largest source of import for the United States is now Mexico, and the second largest is Canada. And already China has become only the third largest import source for the United States. For Japan, China is the largest export market and the largest source of import. For Germany and the UK, US is the largest export market, but China is the largest import source. For France and Italy, which are more active in intra-regional trade, export-import, Germany and Germany. For Canada, again, free trade agreement makes Canadian export, largest export goes to US, and the largest source of import coming from the United States. And for Australia, like Japan, China and China. For Group C countries, Mexico, of course, because of the North American Free Trade Agreement, largest market is US, and largest source is US. Argentina has a famous Mercosur Free Trade Agreement with Brazil and Uruguay. Largest export market is Brazil, but already the largest source of import is China. More amazing is for Brazil, South Korea, Indonesia, India, as well as South Africa. Largest export destination is China, and the largest import source is China. Only for Turkey, because of historical reason, largest export destination is Germany, but largest import source is China. So these table or figure shows that China is strongly included in the global trade relationship, and already, I mean, China's GDP is next to the United States, but China's trade volume is by far the largest in the world, larger than the US. So China is a very important and almost unavoidable trading partner for almost all of G20 countries. So that, as you know, recently US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen told the press that it is impossible for the US economy to be decoupled with the Chinese economy. But US must de-risk with China. That means that erosion of high-tech to China must be avoided, and excessive reliance on rare metals like lithium in China, that should be avoided, and so on and so forth. And already, as I said, U.S. dependence on Chinese import has been declining quite sharply. So this means that the world is now very much fragmented. The world enjoyed so-called extensive globalization after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So 1990s, 2000, the world enjoyed globalization and outright outsourcing, particularly to China. China joined the WTO in 2001, very much requested by the United States. And so after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the world economy enjoyed strong globalization for about 20 years. But when the world faced with various security problems, aggressive Chinese military actions in Southeast Asia, East Asia Sea and South China Sea and the East China Sea, and also the Russian aggression into Georgia, Ukraine in the middle of 2010s. The situation has gradually changed, and now after the Ukraine war, global economy, the world economy is clearly fragmented. So from now on, I would like to talk about the future of the international monetary system, particularly in view of this kind of fragmentation of the world economy. I have to talk about the short or long history of the international monetary system in the last 150 years or something. As you know, the international gold standard was practically started in 1873 and lasted until 1914, until the First World War. This international gold standard initially, of course, introduced by the British Empire and followed by European countries, US, and even Japan subsequently, and then this international gold standard was very instrumental in increasing international trade and investment, and supported global economic growth. But as I said, when the World War first started, erupted in 1914, the British Empire ended the gold standard, and then of course European countries and Japan followed. So the international gold standard had collapsed. But gold non-convertible British pound continued to circulate, during the so-called interwar period. At the same time, the US dollar continued to be gold convertible. So gold non-convertible British pound and gold convertible US dollar circulated during the interwar period. But eventually, even the United States ended gold convertibility. So non-convertible dollar, non-convertible British pound, and even non-convertible yen circulated all over the world. There was no coherent, consistent international monetary system during the interwar period. So interwar period, the world economy was very much fragmented because British Empire introduced the British imperial preference system, while the US introduced infamous smooth whole-trade tariff, and then the world economy was fragmented. US and some Latin American economies, and British and European economies, and also Japan and some Asian economies. So the world economy was fragmented, and international monetary system was also fragmented. And the interwar period had Great Depression, deflation, and war started in 1939. And the world economy was in the war economic situation. But in 1944, the famous Bretton Woods Conference was held in Bretton Woods, United States, and those allied nations agreed to establish the IMF and the World Bank. The core of the IMF was the Bretton Woods system, which had been agreed upon well before the conference between the US and the UK. Of course, US Representative Harry Dexter White and UK Representative John Maynard Keynes had agreed to the resurrection of the fixed exchange rate system in view of the competitive devaluation and complicated international financial system. They agreed to establish or re-establish fixed exchange rate system. But they disagreed how to establish fixed exchange rate system. Keynes initially argued for the creation of a central clearing union based on a common currency, banco. But White rejected such idea and insisted on the establishment of an international monetary fund based on the gold dollar standard. So the actual IMF system was the gold standard, gold dollar standard, meaning that dollar would be convertible to the gold. All other currencies must be fixed vis-a-vis the US dollar, which is gold convertible. So this system flourished quite well and continued until 1971. And as you know, in 1971, President Nixon declared that gold convertibility of the dollar be discontinued, and then the fixed exchange rate regime collapsed completely. So that the Bretton Woods system, fixed exchange rate system under the IMF, gold dollar standard continued only 25 years, less than international gold standard. And since then, gold convertibility never recovered, and the fixed exchange rate regime never recovered, and all major currencies continue to be floating until now. So more than 50 years, the current floating exchange rate regime or flexible exchange rate regime continued, and yet the international currency has been the US dollar, which is not convertible to the dollar. So paper money. But actually in the last 50 years, in some sense, quite stable international monetary system with the US dollar paper money used for almost maybe 70–80% of international transactions, and 60–70% of foreign exchange reserves of the world. And the gold has become demonetized. Of course, even now, gold is included in the foreign exchange and gold reserves for international transactions, but gold has lost the currency status. The only international currency utilized globally is the US dollar. When the European Central Bank, European Eurozone was created, people thought that Euro might become competitive international currency, but Euro has never become competitive international currency. Maybe Euro is used for 15% or so of international transactions and foreign exchange reserves, but quite minor. And now, of course, renminbi is widely used, but still, renminbi's status is only 4% or 5% of international transactions and foreign exchange reserves. So the current situation is dollar standard. Dollar is almost the only usable important international currency, and exchange rates fluctuate everywhere. So no exchange rate stability is regained, but world economy prospered, and everything appeared to be quite sustainable and quite stable. But as I said, world economy has become fragmented, divided, and recalling the situation during the interwar period where the world economy was fragmented and the international monetary system was also fragmented or inconsistent. So the future of the international monetary system, I would argue for four possibilities. One of them is continuous hegemony of the US dollar and continuous floating exchange rate regimes all over the world. That is quite likely because the system is quite robust, surviving 50 years of various economic and other shocks, and so the current system is fairly robust, and most likely outcome of the future international monetary system is the current monetary system continued. That is one possibility. But recalling the interwar period experience under the fragmented or divided world economy, international monetary system may also become rather fragmented. And this is, I think, a real possibility. Already, as you may know, Russia and Saudi Arabia export oil at renminbi prices and in exchange of renminbi to China. So, I mean, until now, all oil prices were quoted in the US dollar, and the settlement has been always done in the US dollar. But in this trade already, renminbi or Chinese yuan has become an international transaction currency. So, and also China has been spreading bilateral swap arrangement, not only with Asian countries, including maybe Nepal, but also with Latin American countries, African countries, almost globally, soliciting more widely used renminbi in international transactions, international trade, and international investment and finance. So there may be some possibility for the renminbi becoming an important international currency, competing with the United States dollar. Now, my good friend Martin Wolf of the Financial Times told me that that is unlikely. Why? His argument is quite simple. The Chinese government could not abolish capital control completely, so that with capital control remaining, Chinese yuan, renminbi would not be freely usable for various transactions, so that Chinese renminbi would not become a strongly competitive currency against the US dollar. But I'm not quite sure. I must say that this is a second possibility. As I said, first possibility, the US dollar dominance is most likely, but second possibility is somewhat divided international monetary system. Chinese renminbi, European euro, and so on, so forth, might be competing with the US dollar. The third possibility is kind of multiple currency system. Why? As you know, multiple currency system is inherently unstable, and so that international gold standard only lasted about 40 years, and Bretton Woods system lasted only 25 years, and single currency international system, the dollar standard, continued 50 years, and most likely to continue for the next several decades. But, as you know, many central banks are now contemplating on introducing CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. And as you can imagine, central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, would be almost costless and quite quick to settle with other currencies, so that the dollar's comparative advantage in lesser cost of exchange and faster settlement process might become less important, so that multiple currencies, multiple CBDCs could be used internationally. This kind of multiple currency system with CBDC is, I think, a possibility, maybe more likely than the second option, that is renminbi competing with US dollar in a traditional sense. That is unlikely. On the other hand, CBDCs, I'm quite sure that by 2030s, major central banks would introduce CBDCs. The first may be the European Central Bank. President of the Central Bank for the Eurozone declared that ECB would introduce by 2027. That is, I think, the end of her term. ECB would introduce CBDC by 2027. And China, as you know, is most advanced in this area, and I am quite sure that even tomorrow, if they decide, they can introduce CBDCs in China as well as for global transactions. Bank of Japan has been relatively cautious, but if Eurozone ECB introduces CBDC and People's Bank China introduces CBDC, then of course Bank of Japan would introduce CBDC. And the Federal Reserve has been most reluctant, cautious as far as CBDCs are concerned, because Federal Congress, US Congress has been against CBDC introduction. But if Europe, China, and Japan introduce CBDCs, I think I'm quite sure that Federal Reserve would also introduce CBDC. So if before 2030s, all major central banks introduce CBDCs, then multiple currency system based on CBDCs might be a possibility. But of course, there's a lot of argument against CBDCs and a lot of argument against multiple currency system. The final possibility is a SDR-centered international monetary system. The SDR was created by the IMF charter change in 1969 to complement the dollar as an international reserve asset. But after 1971 Nixon shock, not much has been allocated. Then in 2022, large amount of SDR, something like 456 billion SDR were allocated, which is equivalent to about $650 billion huge amount of SDRs were allocated. And at the same time, developed countries have agreed to channel allocated SDR to PRGT or RST and other IMF facilities. And also they may also supply SDR to designated holders like MDBs. Actually, almost likely MDBs which could hold SDRs, maybe the World Bank. So in this way, not only member countries, but IMF and MDBs MDBs mean the multilateral development banks, may be designated holders of SDRs, and they can realize seigniorage from SDR allocations. SDR has already been an accounting unit for many international organizations, including United Nations and its agencies, MDBs, including the ADB, and BIS. So SDRs are now, very much utilized accounting unit. But as IMF itself says, the SDR is not a currency, because at this moment, SDR holding is limited to IMF member countries and IMF itself. But if the charter is changed, or if further designation is made, then SDRs may be close to a currency, particularly if the IMF charter is changed so as to allow not only member banks, but member countries, but also member commercial banks to hold SDR. Then, of course, SDR would become a currency, and with enlarged SDR allocations, SDR could be a important international currency, replacing part of the US dollar. I have told this idea to graduate students and professors at Columbia universities, and most of them told me that the US would never accept such charter change. So SDR could not become an international currency, or SDR-centered international monetary system is extremely unlikely. So I showed 4 options for the future international monetary system. The current dollar standard continues, and the somewhat divided, inconsistent international monetary system, like the monetary system during the interwar period. And third is a multiple currency system based on CBDCs. And fourth is SDR-centered international monetary system. As I said, at this moment, I think still the first option is likely to be maintained, but second option and third option might become a reality in the future. But for the moment, I think the first option is likely to be continued, and the fourth option may be quite unlikely, even in the long run. So thank you very much for listening my somewhat, what will I say, speculative argument regarding the future of the international monetary system. particularly under the fragmented world economy. Thank you.
What do you think about the development of regional monetary system with dominant regional currency? Could be for Asia or Latin America or Africa. Maybe that could be the possibility of the future. Do you think that?
Yeah. When I was president of the Asian Development Bank, ADB promoted the idea of Asian regional currency because particularly after the Asian currency crisis in 1997-98, intra-regional exchange rate instability became a big matter of concern among ASEAN plus 3 finance ministries and central banks. So ADB initially promoted the idea of Asian currency unit. It's not regional money, but at least combined exchange rate indicator showing the Asian currencies on the whole moving against the dollar or against the euro. That could be provided, and then each country, ASEAN plus 3 member countries can, looking at the Asian currency unit, trying to deviate or approaching that value through appropriate exchange rate policy and so on and so forth. By so doing, intra-regional exchange rate instability might be ameliorated. So ADB provided every day Asian currency unit combining ASEAN plus 3 exchange rate movement. But most of Asian countries, including, I think, including China, were not very happy to be provided such kind of Asian currency unit. So that was discontinued. So even such kind of regional currency unit, not actual regional money or regional monetary standard, but even that was rejected by some important members of the ASEAN plus 3 context. So I think regional currency idea is, of course, popular in many areas, but actual regional currency is very difficult. As you know, in Africa, so-called CFA franc, few African countries pegging their currencies to the French franc, now the euro. That has been continued for some time, but some member left the CFA franc regime and not very popular even among African countries. And in Latin America, there was some argument for creating regional currency, but none of them materialized. So I think there's some economic rationale for a region like the European Union to have their currency, regional currency, abolishing individual currencies, and so on and so forth. That has some rationale for very integrated economies. But as I said, even among ASEAN plus 3 countries, even among ASEAN countries, ASEAN 10 countries have now established ASEAN economic zone or something, complete freedom of movement of goods and services as well as money, but still they are not inclined to create ASEAN currencies. So sometimes BRICS with expanded membership may aim at creating BRICS currency and so on and so forth, but I don't think it's has any real possibility of achieving, because even 5 BRICS countries are so diverse, so different, not well integrated, and expanded BRICS would be more diversified, and so I don't think BRICS currency has any possibility even in the long run.
My question is, you said that in terms of trade volume, China is the largest and it'll continue to be the largest, maybe for the next 10 years.
Yeah.
This chart is really interesting. And you see that the dominance of China, whether import or export. And you said it's fragmentation, but I see a convergence that China would be the lead player in terms of both export and import. Now, if this goes on for the next 15, 20 years, what is the implication for the developed world? You mentioned about American policy. And what is this implication to the developing world? So I don't see a fragmentation, I see a conversion that China will be dominant in terms of trade volume for the next 15, 20 years. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, as I said, at this stage, China is the largest trading partner for many countries, and so dominant, decoupling with the Chinese economy is impossible. And also the Chinese economy may continue to grow and becoming even more important as the trading partner for many countries. That is true. On the one hand, the fragmentation has been caused not by economic factors, but by military and hegemonic conditions and so on and so forth. So difficult to predict, and really I don't know whether G7, including the US, continue to strengthen regulations against China or not. I don't know. Maybe depending on Chinese reactions, G7 countries may either strengthen or soften their regulations against China. But this is very difficult to predict. Second, much more easy prediction is to say that the Chinese economic growth will continue to decline, slow down. Why? Because, as I said in the first session, China has become a high-income country with more than 13,000 per capita GDP, 13,000 US dollars per capita GDP. In that sense, China has overcome middle income trap and has become high-income country, developed country, not developing country anymore. And the technological gap between developed country and China has shrunk, and from now on, just importing, assimilating technologies developed in developed countries would not very much contribute to Chinese economic growth. Secondly, China's working age population has been declining, and total population apparently started to decline from last year. So Chinese economic growth at this stage, 5%, may continuously slow down toward 3 to 4%. And some IMF economists argue that by 2030, China's medium-term sustainable growth rate would slow down to 3.5%. And 3.5% is a very important milestone or benchmark because the world economy has grown about 3.5% in the last 20 years. Annual average growth rate in the last 20 years has been 3.5%. So when China's growth potential has become 3.5%, means that China would lose any power to raise global economic growth. China will become a median or medium performer. This is really important point. And so apart from military or security factors and fragmentation also, this is anyway very difficult to predict. But easy to predict is, in any case, Chinese economic growth will continue to slow down. And on the other hand, India's potential growth rate, again, according to IMF economists, would be 7 to 8% in the next few decades. So that global growth center would shift from China to India. So I'm not particularly pessimistic about fragmentation. Fragmentation is a real fact and caused by non-economic factors and very difficult to predict. So that anyway, we have to be well prepared to respond to this kind of situation in the world economy. The other factor is likely economic slowdown in China, which would affect not only the entire economy, but particularly the Asian economy. As I explained by the first table, Asian economies are so much dependent on China. So Chinese economic slowdown would negatively affect Asian economic growth in coming years and decades. So Asian economies must make further effort, redouble their effort to diversify their economic activities other than China, because Chinese economic growth anyway slows down. I think this is the most likely outcome, not particularly related to fragmentation, not particularly related to the future of the international monetary system, but rather the real potential growth rate of China in the coming years and decades.